You know what, guys? I understand that a lot of these people in these movies get questioned and everyone thinks they're the killer, but why hasn't anyone said lawyer? That's it. Hey, Poirot, lawyer, lawyer. And then the case is done. You can't really do too much. Wait till the ship gets back to the dock. What's going on, everyone? James here with another real review, and today I'm so excited to get into my spoiler-free thoughts for Death on the Nile. Thank you so much to 20th Century Studios for giving me the chance to watch this in theater. There are some things that make for a good theatrical experience, and then there are some elements of this movie that aren't so great. But before we dive into my positives and my negatives, if it is your first time here at the channel, welcome to Real James, where I love talking about movies and TV just like this. So if you do too, go ahead and hit the big red button below, subscribe to the channel, tap on that bell, and hit the thumbs up button if you are a big fan of these movies. I know a lot of people loved Murder on the Orient Express. As for me, well, back when this was Reflect the Screen, I didn't like that movie too much. If you've already seen the movie, go ahead and get loud down below in the comments and let me know exactly what you think about the film. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Or do you fall kind of in the middle? Alrighty, also, for those who don't know too much, yes, this is a direct sequel to Murder on the Orient Express. There's a really good bit of backstory in the beginning of this film where it gives you a little bit of an origin for Poirot, which is kind of cool. So it kind of ties up a little bit of loose ends if anyone had any thoughts about this detective and his origin, which I didn't, but I digress. The film is directed by Kenneth Branagh and it stars Gal Gadot, Tom Bateman, Kenneth Branagh himself, Letitia Wright, Emma Mackey, and many others. And if you don't know too much about the story without spoiling anything, like I said, this is a sequel to 2017's Murder on the Orient Express. While on vacation on the Nile, Hercule Poirot must investigate the murder of a young heiress named Lynette Ridgway. And if you're wondering, yes, this movie's finally hitting theaters February 11th. I mean, it's been delayed a couple of times, and I'm sure a lot of fans of the first film are dying for the sequel. Now, like I mentioned, I didn't like Murder on the Orient Express too much at all. It was a little boring for me, so I came into this with an open mind, hoping that maybe the mistakes of the first film, in my opinion, were rectified here. In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. But I want to stay confident, of course, and let's begin with the positives, and that is this ensemble cast. There are some really good performances here. The standouts for me are, of course, the ever-consistent Kenneth Branagh as Poirot, this detective that, honestly, I absolutely loved seeing crack the case. There are these subtleties he has where he's just observing people, and maybe he raises an eyebrow or he kind of like nods his head a little bit, and it's really cool to see him sort of just engage with people without actually talking to them. But when he does sit down and have these one-on-one interviews where he's trying to figure out who done it, I loved it. I thought it was really fun. Sometimes the interviews were getting to a good spot and then there were these weird interruptions, but it's more of a story structure issue for me. I just really thought that this performance was just so consistent from the first, and he was one of my favorite performances in the first movie, so it just kind of carries over here. And when it comes to snappy dialogue and a little bit of swagger, I absolutely love Letitia Wright and Sophie Okonedo's performances. In this film, they do play family. Sophie Okonedo is a very famous blues musician, and her niece is, if I'm not mistaken, of course, Letitia Wright's character. And I loved both of them together, but individually, I thought they did a really good job at kind of elevating scenes. When things were a little bit boring in that first and third act, I really thought that both of them were able to pick things up, and it kind of gave the movie a boost when it really needed it. And yes, this might be an unpopular opinion once the movie hits theaters, but I really liked Emma Mackey's performance as Jacqueline Del Belfour, if I'm pronouncing that, of course, correctly. She was engaged to Armie Hammer's character, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but I thought that Emma Mackey did a really good job at providing a lot of range. Like, for one moment, she was really happy, and the other moment, she's literally like some mischievous, conniving woman, and I was like, wait a second, like, something's gonna go down. Like, just the most subtle of facial expressions from her just kind of sent chills down my spine in some scenes, especially her interactions with Poirot. I really thought that Emma Mackey delivered a good performance here, and I know some others might not like it and think that she's overacting a little bit, which I can kind of see in some instances, but for me, she really gave what needed to be given in some of these scenes that she was featured. So those are all of my standout performances, but outside of the acting, I thought that this movie did a decent job at building atmosphere. It didn't do the best job in some scenes, but I will tell you that I love the fact that some of these shots felt like they were on location, so there was a very vast scale to this film that really did make for a good experience on the big screen. Now, our screening wasn't in IMAX, but it still felt very grand. It felt very wide, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. It's setting the mood in a sense. Now, of course, there were scenes where there was blue or green screen used, but it still felt pretty good for the most part. Were some of those scenes noticeable? Heck yeah, there were some CGI crocodiles and birds and stuff that I don't know why the film decided to really give a decent chunk of screen time too, and then there were some green screen moments that were a little obvious, but I'd have to imagine that either A, maybe the pandemic, or B, reshoots, anything of the sort, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here. However, you're gonna notice some scenes that kind of are distracting. In one more technical note, I really did like the soundtrack used here. If anything, I think the soundtrack was used a lot better in the first half of the movie, where there were some moments that these old-timey songs fit the mood and the montages that we were seeing on screen. So I do think that whomever was responsible for curating the soundtrack did a good job at picking songs that fit the mood of the film. The score is a little, it's not as noticeable, to be honest. It's not really standing out, but it was the soundtrack to me that stood out the most. And of course, if you are a fan of Murder on the Orient Express, I think there's a lot here for fans to chew on. You got the classic whodunit build up, and of course you have that climax and the reveal, which was cool until it wasn't, and I'll kind of explain that and dance around some spoilers later. But I did think that the movie for the most part is going to appease fans of the first film, and if you're not 100% on board with Orient Express, you might, like me, not really care too much for this movie by the end, and that's where we're going to start with the negatives. It's the reveal wasn't 100% there for me, and by the end I was left feeling a little bit empty. I thought that the payoff wasn't really worth the build-up, and even the climax felt like it lasted for such a short amount of time. Now maybe I'm misremembering, but Murder on the Orient Express, at least for me, had a little bit of a longer period of time where Poirot was actually, well, investigating. Here it kind of felt rushed, and that's because the film takes a lot of time in that first act to get going. There's a very extended club scene that could have been shortened, I'm not gonna lie to you, and unfortunately there were some performances here as well that bogged down the movie. So let's jump on over to the other half of the ensemble cast that really didn't do much for me at all. And it begins with Armie Hammer, who is, of course, in hot water. I won't really explain why, but there's enough for you there to chew on. You get it? Okay. Armie Hammer plays Simon Doyle, who is madly in love with Jacqueline de Belfort in the beginning of the film, and eventually, guys, his character takes a turn that I didn't see coming, but again, his acting was just nothing to note. That's the issue, is that Armie Hammer, there's one scene in particular where he's crying, and it is so forced, and I didn't really buy it. There's not a lot of convincing that he does for me in this movie. He, as an actor, I didn't think he was really that bad in Call Me By Your Name, but at the same time, I didn't think he was like Oscar worthy. I know that's a weird adjective and a weird thing to say, but so many people were blowing him up saying give him the Oscars and all that stuff, and here I think he proves that he, for me, is just one of those like middle of the road type of actors, and the performance he gave here was really forgettable. And then there's Gal Gadot, who, guys, I genuinely like. I do like her performances in the Fast saga, and I liked her performance in Wonder Woman, and even though a lot of people didn't like Wonder Woman 1984, I thought she did a solid job. I will tell you though, here she plays Lynette Ridgway, and I'm sorry y'all, but she was really stiff and her line delivery was not the greatest. Now, the writing, of course, for her character maybe is supposed to paint her as someone who is paranoid that, oh my gosh, these people are out for me and my money, which is a good angle, but I don't think it was necessarily executed very well, so maybe it is a little bit of a script issue. But when it comes to Gal Gadot's performance here, again, she was a little wooden, a little stiff, and I don't necessarily think for the amount of time that she was given in that first half that it really sold me on her performance. And of course, in any ensemble cast, you're gonna get some performances that really are, well, they're there, but I just didn't really gravitate towards them. As much as Tom Bateman kills it in the first, I think, like 20 minutes of this movie, I feel like Book just kind of disappears a little bit, especially towards the end, and I'm like, man, you spend so much time kind of building up this awesome back and forth chemistry between Book, and Poirot, but then it kind of just dissipates and it doesn't really go anywhere for me. So again, it didn't leave a lasting impact. And then even Russell Brand, who plays one of the doctors here, a scorned lover of Lynette Ridgway, I thought that there was potential there for the character, but he is just very one-dimensional, unfortunately, and I think Russell Brand is a pretty darn good actor in some instances, but here it just didn't work for me. And that's one of my biggest issues about this film, is that the ensemble cast just really didn't do too much to sell me on the fact that this was going to be an enjoyable experience for over 2 hours. The pacing was a little off, especially with the story itself, and I did feel like it was dragging at the end, so once we finally do get to the reveal, again, I was just left wondering, really? Like, that's it? And I never want to walk out of a whodunit that way. I didn't do that with Knives Out, and I definitely, hopefully, will not do that with Knives Out too. But with Death on the Nile, I think this was a sequel that unfortunately didn't do much to wipe away the taste I had in my mouth from Murder on the Orient Express. And one more technical note before we get into my overall thoughts. Guys, the cinematography here was odd. Some instances I thought were okay, but for the most part, framing here in this movie was not its strong suit. There were some bits of composition that I felt were so off, and yeah, it's trying to be different by giving us this back and forth, like a shot reverse shot in a sense, between objects like chairs and everything, and I just didn't really vibe with that. It was distracting to me. I love cinematography that gives scenes an edge without being wholly distracting from the conversation. So there was one conversation between Book and Poirot where I'm thinking, why are we watching this through a chair? And yeah, it'll make sense if you do see the film, but for me, it just didn't work. So overall, you guys, Death on the Nile for me is definitely a little bit better than Murder on the Orient Express, but it has a decent ensemble cast that I think fails to be used properly. Like I mentioned, there are some awesome standouts, Letitia Wright, Sophia Okonedo, even Emma Mackey, and Kenneth Branagh, but outside of that, how do you have Annette Bening in this movie and she's reduced to a role that honestly didn't work because they didn't write her character well? And that happens pretty often. Do I think fans are gonna love this one, especially if they enjoyed the first? Absolutely. But for those who weren't really convinced with Orient Express, I don't think that there's a lot for you guys here to really fall in love with. And even though I did say earlier that I like it better than the first film, it's really not that much better. I felt, again, empty when the reveal came. I didn't really care too much for a lot of the buildup because the payoff soured me. So, like I mentioned, I reviewed this movie, of course, and gave it a 2.5 out of 5 on Reflect the Screen when this was Reflect the Screen, a written website. But now, I gotta tell you, I'd probably give it like a 3 out of 5. I don't necessarily think it's worth going and seeing if you didn't care too much for the first film, but when it hits streaming eventually, I think it might be worth a weekend watch on like a rainy day. So the movie's not bad, it's not great, but for me, it is just a little too forgettable. So there you have it, you guys. That's my real review of Death on the Nile. Again, it hits theaters February 11th. So when you see this film in theaters, go ahead, come back. Let me know down below in the comments what you thought. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? And hey, if you want to see more reviews and reactions this week, because we got the Oscar nominations, I got Blacklight, Love is Blind, and so much more to cover, and that's just this week, go ahead and hit the big red button below. Subscribe to the channel, tap on that bell, and hit the thumbs up button as well. Guys, it's been fun talking about this whodunit. It unfortunately is not as fun of a film, but you know what? I'm happy that at least, fans hopefully will enjoy this. And again, I'm just gonna say lawyer if Poirot comes around. Lawyer for anything. He can ask me, are you having a good day? Lawyer. Alrighty, y'all. Again, thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you at the next screening.